to those of you who are here to this Team Society, NTNU Energy Team Society webinar. Just to remind everyone of what this is. So Team Society is a platform here at NTNU where we, on the one hand, seek to promote and disseminate work on sustainability and energy that goes on within and around the involved communities here at NTNU. And we also have some research projects that we conduct within this program. And today we have a guest, Professor Cymene Howe, and I'll introduce her in two ways. One of them is related to her link to NTNU. So she's a newly hired researcher there at the Department of Social Anthropology. And she has a position there which is sponsored by NTNU Oceans on behalf of a new university initiative titled NTNU Arctic to promote Arctic science, policy, and research programming. And this is a multidisciplinary program established by geography, marine biology, social anthropology, and engineering, and includes goals of connecting university objectives in support of the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development to the proposed study of an emerging Arctic blue economy. So a very interesting initiative. Cymene Howe herself is a professor and director of the graduate studies in the Department of Anthropology at Rice University in the US, which is also why we're here at a slightly different time than usual. And she's written multiple books, including Intimate Activism on Duke University Press, Anthropocene Unseen, a lexicon on punctum, and Ecologies, Wind and Power in the Anthropocene on Duke. So these books follow humans and more than human lives intertwined with the renewable energy futures, and her current research now focuses on adaptation to ice loss in Arctic region and sea level rise in coastal cities around the world. So there's a lot of interesting stuff to be said here. I'll just give you the floor then, Cymene.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tomas, so much for the really nice introduction. And I think I'll pop my screen up here now too, if I can find the proper button. Let's see if everyone can see it. Do you see that okay?
Yes, but not in presenter mode yet.
There we go. How about that?
There we go. Looks nice.
Great, thank you. So yes, thank you so much, Tomas, for the lovely introduction, and to NTNU Oceans and the Team Society for inviting me to give this presentation today. I wanted to begin, as Tomas mentioned, I'm coming to you from Houston, Texas, which is formerly the lands of indigenous people known as the Sana, Atakapa, Ishak, Coahuiteca, and Karanakawa, and Akokisa people, who before colonial dispossession lived along the Galveston River and this space that's now called the Greater Houston area. I also want to begin by thanking Sarah for all her amazing organizational work, and Irina and Chantel for reading the paper and for providing comments. It's really very helpful, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion with everyone. So today I'd like to speak with you about some of the work that I've been doing in public anthropology over the last several years, with an eye to the next few years of research that I'm looking toward. And I'm going to be moving through this work in two different ways, two different parts. And I'll be beginning in the Arctic region with the question of melt in the country of Iceland and the loss of cryospheres. And I'll be moving then into a discussion of rising seas along the coasts that border the world ocean, and looking at how these dynamics can be understood at the kind of nexus of anthropology and climate change models in what I think of as a reckoning with publics and a public reckoning with the transformations of climate change. So across this work, I keep four principles in mind, namely that climatological crisis requires solutions that are grounded in principles of climate justice and that this involves responding to different kinds of interlocking socio-environmental forms of precarity that are both social and ecological, and also recognizing that we as researchers need to intentionally move our scientific work toward benefiting the communities that we work with and toward a politics of engagement. And so I found the work from Max Liboiron to be, and their group to be very interesting in terms of thinking through reconciliation science and how that co-articulates with public anthropology and the goals of working more closely with communities. Now here you have a screenshot of the page, of the front page for the latest IPCC report that focuses specifically on how climate change is affecting oceans, coasts, and cryospheres. And I'll tell you, as you probably know, there is rarely much good news in these reports. This latest overview of the scientific consensus confirms that the world's melting ice sheets and glaciers are currently the dominant source of sea level rise around the world, more than oceanic thermal expansion. And in particular, that glaciers melting in the Arctic region specifically, along with the Greenlandic ice sheet, are the cause for most of the sea level rise that we're seeing around the planet. So for comparison, we can see that between 2002 and 2017, Greenland lost about 260 billion tons of ice per year, while Antarctica, a much larger ice sheet, of course, lost only about 140 billion tons. From 2006 to 2015, the global mean sea level rise sea level has risen about 2.5 times faster than during the entirety of the 20th century. So we know that sea levels are rising faster and further than expected. And as the IPCC report shows, this process is truly accelerating. So here's a little topographical map of the country of Iceland. A few places on Earth have actually experienced what I call the great melting more dramatically than the country of Iceland, where you have about 10% of the island's surface that is covered in ice. But now, of course, the country is losing about 11 billion tons of ice per year. In 2016, I began an anthropological research project that I called MELT, the social life of ice at the top of the world, where I was trying to understand the cultural impact of ice loss amongst Icelanders whose lives and landscapes have been so shaped by the cryosphere, so conditioned by these conditions for the last 1,200 years. And a conservative estimate shows that all of Iceland's remaining glaciers will be gone by the year 2170. That's what the glaciologists and other scientists have predicted. Now, Anna Singh, an anthropologist very interested in environmental questions, has described the condition of precarity as what she calls life without the promise of stability. And these do feel like very precarious times in so many ways. Life without the promise of stability has also long defined Iceland as a barren land in the North Atlantic that has suffered bouts of starvation and faced the forces of nature quite head on. Although they have settled an uninhabited island, like many First Nation people in the Arctic, Icelanders have lived closely with ice for a very, very long time. So I began to think of this icy intimacy as a kind of cryo-human relationship where bodies of ice are so entangled with human settlement that the two become integral to one another in many ways. In a land defined by ice that is now melting away, I've been working to understand how people respond to the loss of it as cryospheres that seemed to be forever are now being turned literally to water. Now, Helgi Bjornsson is a man who knows a great deal about ice. He is one of Iceland's preeminent glaciologists, and so I turned to him to learn more about the country's cryoforms and the science that understands them. When I met with him, Helgi explained that glaciers have long been described in terms more common to living beings. He said that they have toes and snouts and tongues. These are the kinds of words that glaciologists use to describe the corpus or the body of a glacier. And he also described the term of ablation. This is a word that's borrowed from surgery, human surgery, to designate the loss of flesh. It's the term that glaciologists and scientists use to describe the melting and calving of glacial ice forms. And Helge's work over the decades now shows that ablation is happening much faster than he had predicted or imagined originally. The mass balance, as it's called, required for glacial equilibrium is no longer holding. Now, Guðfinna Alþjóðsdóttir, Helge's younger protege, who you see here with the pencil in her hand, is the kind of person you would want to have by your side on a glacier. Here you see her also with a group of students. She takes a team of them up to Sólheimajökull every summer to measure the loss of ice there. And Guðfinna belongs to a new generation of scientists who are seeing accelerations everywhere. In the older climate models, glaciers were white splotches on graphs and charts. Now that they are changing so quickly that they have become more central to the dynamic systems of climate modeling, Guðfinna points out. Guðfinna explains that glaciology is actually becoming more like meteorology, chasing rapidly changing mercurial phenomenon. And she also tells me that what we humans are doing is, as she said, the largest uncontrolled experiment in the history of the world. And she finalized this by saying, we shall see where it leads. On the far eastern edge of the Icelandic highlands, I met with Hulda and Guðni, sheep farmers who have lived their entire lives at the foot of a glacial tongue called Fláajökull. As we sat around their little wooden dining table drinking dark coffee, I asked them about the glacier that lurks just around the bend from their farm. Like many of his neighbors, Guðni knows that glaciers can become quite monstrous, toppling houses and uprooting barns as they crawl across the earth with their glacial bodies. They also threaten those below with glacial outburst floods, massive rushing rivers of water and ice the size of cars. And both Hulda and Guðni remember stories of people and animals whisked far out to sea by glacial floods, lost to the frigid waters of the North Atlantic. Now here you see Guðni pointing toward his glacier, the one tucked behind his farm. He agreed after much reflection that he can sometimes, and only sometimes, find beauty in the glacier near his home. He wanted this picture, he explained to me, for posterity, for the time when the glacier itself will be gone. When I first spoke about glaciers with the poet André Snær Magnusson, who would later become a good friend and collaborator, he put it this way. He said that glaciers used to be or were forever. When my grandmother traveled across the glaciers, it was in the context of eternity. It was like the waves, the rocks, the sand, things that would change only over thousands of years. But now many of these same glaciers will vanish in the time between when someone is born today and when they become my grandmother's age. In these kinds of cryo-human encounters or relationships, we are caught between elegiac mourning and worries that are tied to the future subjunctive, the impending conditions of collapsing possibilities and signs of precarity, questions of what might be in the future. In the domain of public anthropology, as many of you know, has been committed to illuminating the larger social issues of our times and encouraging broad public conversations about them to foster social change. This involves often responding to specific conditions and collaborating with communities in quite engaged research. And it also often involves engaging with media. And while the media can reach, because the media can reach publics in ways, often in ways that academic programs just do not have the capacity to do. And so with my research in Iceland, I have been working on academic papers and formal presentations in social scientific venues, but I've also been continuing to experiment with media forms in a kind of multimodal anthropological form. And for the MELT project, I collaborated with fellow anthropologist Dominic Boyer and Ragi Hansson, an Icelandic filmmaker, to create an ethnographic film in the hopes that it might reach a wider audience and also be used in classrooms, hopefully, to teach about the impacts of climate change. And we called this movie, a short documentary, we called it Not Okay or Not Ok, a little movie about a small glacier at the end of the world. And the protagonist of that movie was a mountain that used to be home to a glacier called Ok. Here you see a portrait of Auk Mountain from the top. This is the caldera at the top of the volcano. This is the place where the little glacier used to call home. I had come across the story of Auk in a rather accidental way. As I was looking for glaciers and the people who might know them, Auk was right there on the map, but there was almost nothing about Auk anyplace else except for this. From a small English language magazine called the Iceland Review, it was a note that said in a rather subdued way that one of Iceland's smallest yet most famous glaciers, Auk, is about to disappear forever. As of now, Auk, it said, no longer qualifies as a glacier. So Auk was, in fact, according to glaciologists, no longer a glacier. It had ceased to exist, if you will, and yet there was almost no news about it beyond this little article that in total was only 79 words. To me, that seemed a pretty small obituary for a major, famous Icelandic glacier, even if it was a diminutive and small glacier. Now, Aukjökull, and Jökull means glacier in Icelandic, was with us for about 800 years. It first appeared on a famed glacier map from 1792 that detailed the Langjökull glacial family, the second largest ice collection and cluster in Iceland. Here you see it in 1986 on the left-hand side, and here again in 2019 from a NASA satellite. This is how Aukjökull looked in these respective years. And as you can see, the glacial mass is entirely gone. There's just remnant ice left on the northern side here in the 2019 picture. So from Hallgrímur Ármannsson, I learned that Auk Mountain has its own special skills. Hallgrímur is a linguist who works at a government institute that's dedicated to the research and preservation of place names. And he told me rather proudly that Auk can actually write its own name. And he added for emphasis, that is pretty special for a mountain. Seen from the sky, as in this aerial photograph from an Icelandic photographer, Auk's assemblage of rock and snow make an O in the circle of the caldera, and then you can see the C formed in rock in the interior of it. In ancient Icelandic, that is precisely how Auk would have been spelled, O-C, rather than O-K, as it is in modern Icelandic. And as Hallgrímur pointed out, it looks very much like the copyright symbol that has become so world famous. When I circled back to the glaciologist Helgi Björnsson, he told me that if I really wanted to learn more about Auk, I needed to talk with Oddur Sigurdsson, whom Helgi called the Auk guy. Oddur was a glaciologist who had first recorded Auk's passing back in the year 2014. And when I asked Oddur how he felt about the loss of Aukjökull, this little glacier that he had been watching for so many years, he took a long pause and stared back into my question. Over time, he said he had developed a certain fondness for Auk, the glacier with the funny name, and now it was gone. He explained to me, it is a loss. It is a little like losing an old friend. Now, glaciers, as many of you know, are all about time. They have fern lines that work out like tree rings to show their age. They are a record of wars and eruptions, weather, and atomic blasts. The renowned glaciologist Richard Alley describes glaciers as time machines. They hold on to the past, a frozen document of climates and creatures. But now, as they expire, glaciers portend a future, I would argue, as well. In part, what was so troubling about Auk's demise was the relative silence around it, the collective shrug that the world seemed to have given to the loss of this glacier. Now, as an anthropologist, I'm keenly aware that recognizing a death commits us to imagining a new future or a next future, because we know that deaths without mourning are in fact extinctions. So this was the spirit behind a memorial ceremony that we decided to host for Aukjökull, Auk Glacial, a glacier upon Auk Mountain. And in August of 2019, with Oddur and Guðfinna, artists and youth climate activists, we held a kind of makeshift funeral of sorts. And the memorial on top of Auk Mountain was actually the first memorial to a fallen glacier in the world. It was to memorialize a glacier that had died, in effect, or had been felled by climate change. We asked Andrés Snær Magnusson, the author and poet and filmmaker, to write the words for the memorial plaque, which came first in Icelandic, but was also translated into English to read this. Ok is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it. Now, Åkjökull's passing had originally gone virtually without notice, but in its memorializing, in the recognition of this death that is becoming an extinction event, this little glacier became the subject of much global media attention. So the story of Åkjökull's life and now its death and the memorial for its death became quite surprisingly to us headline news all over the world, including in places in the United States like CNN. The New York Times featured a opinion piece by the Prime Minister of Iceland on its front page. And it appeared in media outlets such as these, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, Der Spiegel, Le Monde, The Guardian in the UK, Canadian broadcasting on television in Australia, Germany, India, Switzerland, United Kingdom, and all over the United States. We even saw that unlikely outlets like the car magazine called Popular Mechanics and the fashion magazine called Elle gave it full features to the story of this little glacier. The Economist, the global British magazine, dedicated its first ever obituary to a non-human, to Åkjökull in its special climate issue. And along with Greta Thunberg's transatlantic crossing in her zero carbon sailboat, Åkjökull was the biggest environmental story of the summer of 2019, generated well over 10,000 news stories all over the world. And this is one of the ways in which public anthropology can make a difference. It involves collaborative work with communities and public messaging about the critical issues we face. It means also feeling the climate crisis that is befalling us and is befalling us all. It involves taking seriously the socio-natural relations that comprise our shared worlds. So we know that the loss of ice in the Arctic and elsewhere is becoming a bloated ocean around the world. Iceland's melt means that somewhere else far away is experiencing sea level rise. Throughout the time I've been working on melt in Iceland, I've been thinking about the dynamics of the other end of this cycle, that is how melt becomes rise. Because we know absolutely, and according to the IPCC without question, that dead cryospheres are in fact resurrected as emergent hydrospheres. But what if we were able to actually follow the water, was my question. What meanings and perhaps politics might tie these places to one another through the vehicle of melted ice becoming part of the world ocean? Here's another number from the IPCC. Reports that sea level rise in the year 2100 will be between 18 to 59 centimeters globally. But many experts believe that an overall sea level rise of 1 meter worldwide by the end of the century is in fact more realistic. That means in approximately 80 years, about 200 million people will live on land likely to be submerged at high tide. So building on the physical connectivity of water in the Melt Rise project, I will be working collaboratively with communities to understand how they're contending with these changing hydrospheres by comparing adaptation responses. I'm proposing that these evolving hydrological cycles are in fact creating new and often invisible lines of connectivity across the world, a connectivity that is both social and material in the form of water. So let me give you a quick picture of the scientific grounding and basis of this project. Forecasting the relationship between future changes to Earth's cryosphere and its impact upon sea levels has been a very challenging project for scientists to predict. However, a group of physicists at NASA recently created and released an interactive modeling tool that's called the Gradient Fingerprint Map. And the GFM shows with great accuracy where freshwater melt is becoming sea level rise in 293 of the world's coastal cities. Currently, this is the only modeling tool capable of attributing specific locations of melting ice with their effects on the world's coastal cities. In our conversation together, the lead physicist in the development of the Gradient Fingerprint Map, the GFM, put it this way. He said, melt ice anywhere in the world, and we can show you that what the shape of the ocean will adopt. Now, what the model shows us is that in coastal cities, suffering sea level inundation can be directly tied to a particular location of ice loss. The GFM also renders local sea level changes as they relate to each of the world's ice drainage systems. In other words, it can track melt from the Antarctic to the Alps, from the Canadian Arctic to the Andes, and from Svalbard to the Himalaya. The NASA scientists created the GFM and put it online so that it would be available to coastal communities and planners, coastal planners, as they prepare for sea level rise. However, I'm grateful to them for creating the tool, which now serves as the heuristic or the foundation for my research, because it does allow me to follow the water from the melting north, from the melting poles to places where sea level is increasing and rising. And I believe that the journey of water from the Arctic to lower latitude cities will also help to explain and show us unexpected stories of connections and transformations along the way. Already there are surprising outcomes. So I'll ask you to think for a second where you would guess that the largest proportion of Icelandic melt is arriving as sea level upon a coastal city's shores. I'll tell you that it's not London or Jakarta or Miami. It is in fact Cape Town, South Africa. And the city in the United States that's most being affected by Greenlandic melt and the Greenlandic ice sheet is in fact the city of Honolulu. And here you can see the graphs and charts that the GFM shows you when you look up certain cities and glacial basins to show you the amount of contribution that each basin is making to each of these cities. So in this project, I will be able to compare adaptation practices across each of these 4 sites. I'll be looking at the policies and priorities within communities and governmental agencies following investments in infrastructure like seawalls and port reconstruction, as well as changes in production and labor like fishing and community relocation or planned retreat in the case of coasts. So the essence of the project is to foreground how places are in fact connected by the material form of water, focusing in on that synchronization to make visible those links and explore the shared and divergent responses through these comparisons. And we can look at the comparison between sites of melt, in the case of Iceland and Greenland in this case study, but also across sites of melt and rise. So comparing how adaptations might be different or similar in a place like Iceland and Cape Town or Greenland and Honolulu in terms of the scale and level of commitment that communities are making to adaptation. So this 3-year pilot project is exactly that, a pilot project with 4 case sites funded through the National Science Foundation in the United States. It's what they call a proof of concept grant that's meant to establish an innovative methodological method, bringing together the social sciences and the physical sciences. So this means I'll be able to determine in the process the best ethnographic routes to, and to engage with communities directly that I'll be working with. It's an especially flexible research model that's open to change and suggestions from affected publics, and I intend to keep it that way. The project is also intended for expansion to multiple field sites beyond the 4 that I'll begin with. So in addition to a community-informed set of methodological approaches, I also see possibilities for some theoretical innovation in this project. As the world's water becomes differently distributed under the impact of anthropogenic forces through the collapsing cryosphere and sea level rise, extreme rain events, and groundwater depletion, I am thinking with the concept of what I'm calling hydrological globalization. This is one that traces the emergent connections between water in motion and responses to it. So with hydrological globalization, we find global connectivities not primarily through the links of trade, migration, finance, or media, but through physical relationships created as our hydrosphere is reshaped. Conceptually, it allows us to follow the impacts and uptakes of watery rearrangements, connecting geographical sites, both materially and socially, by literally connecting them through their and our water. So since the early 1990s, as you probably are well aware, the study of globalization has typically been defined in terms of circulation and flow. We have Arjuna Potterai scapes, we have Bauman's liquid modernity, we have commodity chain analysis. However, globalization seems to have a renewed life in the Anthropocene, I would argue. Moore and Malm borrow from Wallerstein's older world systems theory and political ecology to propose that the Capitalocene more correctly identifies a now global system abetting destructive human impacts upon natural systems. Deleuze and Guattari's deterritorializations continue to have theoretical influence as scholars remain interested in mining the possibilities of the rhizomatic. Debates in the social sciences have also seen the return of the hyper. In early globalization studies, you may remember that hyperspaces were exemplified by airports and global franchise restaurants that were seen as detached from any local referent. Then detachment was considered key. Now we have the hyper object, in Timothy Morton's terms, exemplified in things like climate change and styrofoam, entities that greatly exceed all human scale in their temporal duration and spatial dispersion, and yet are quite sticky in the ways that they interconnect humans and others through space and time. And in this case, attachment is key. So that was a lot of theoretical history and present. So let me just summarize here. With globalization, hydrological globalization, we have a balance between these key thematics. So from deterritorialization, a land-based metaphor, to hydrological globalization, a water-based physicality. From detachment in hyperspaces to attachment through hyper objects and relations like the world ocean, and from scapes and flows that have been largely grounded in human movement and commerce and ideological exchange to a focus upon the physical consequences of Earth system transformation as they affect socio-natural forms and futures. So Anna Singh's work in friction and the Matsutake project have been quite an inspiration for this work, illustrating how we find relations translocally. But the further step here is to move beyond scapes and flows and to center attention explicitly on how Earth systems entangle social worlds in a time of Anthropocenic globalization. And here I think that the physicist Eric Laurer's mention of the shape of the ocean is quite interesting to think about the distinction of flows, circulation, and transforming shapes. The Anthropocene is changing the processes of globalization, reshaping them and showing us clear points of erosion in our prior theoretical models. Here, the focus is on interconnectivity, where indigenous philosophy and feminist science studies have much to offer in the way of recognizing relations and the critical need for relational models of attention and care. These kinds of attentions to relations, to entanglement and to care, and here I'm thinking of Donna Haraway and Karen Barad, demonstrate the value of attachment and connectivity in new ways. And it's these kinds of attachments and connections that I'm interested in exploring in this project and understanding as adaptation practices. So in the work that I've shared with you today, I've aimed to highlight the potential of physical processes to foretell social futures. And I also hope to have underscored the importance of public anthropological work that has the ability to not only engage with local communities, but also to speak with wider audiences. And I thank you for your time and attention and look forward to our conversation.